Okay, gang, welcome back. Now it's time to talk about fluvial systems in our GPH 111 class. So, fluvial systems is just a fancy word. Fluvial is a fancy word for saying rivers and streams and creeks and flowing water really on the continents of any type. That's considered a fluvial system. And here's a definition of fluvial processes. Collection of surface water into organized sequence of channelized forms whereby sediment is transported from the continents to the ocean basins. And I don't know, everybody loves rivers and streams. These are a couple of pictures I've taken of rivers and streams, throughout the years. They're beautiful, even if you like fishing, if you like sitting in water. They're great, and they're fascinating. So, if you pick up a typical GPH 111 textbook, they're going to teach you certain concepts and landforms, meanders, oxbow lakes, these sorts of things. And I'm going to try and cover those for you in our lab. But that's not why I find rivers fascinating. So I'm going to branch off the path. I don't think that's the right phrase. Branch off the road. I'm going to kind of go my own direction here a little bit about what I find fascinating about rivers and streams. And that's what I'm going to share with you. So before we begin, let's go over this diagram again. As you've heard me say a couple times now, when sediment gets dumped off in the ocean basins, it begins our rock cycle. That sediment gets compacted to form sedimentary rocks. If it gets buried, it's going to heat up and cook into metamorphic rocks. If it continues to get buried, it'll eventually melt and form magma. And the reason it's hot is because of isotopic decay in our Earth's surface, Earth's interior, I apologize. And as that magma gets injected back onto our continents through tectonic processes forming mountains, you form igneous rocks. And then that rock becomes exposed to the hydrologic cycle. And the hydrologic cycle is when water evaporates off our oceans via solar energy, condenses into our clouds, and then those clouds rain on the rock. And the presence of rain in our atmosphere on these rocks breaks them down. They don't like it. They formed way down here deep in the earth, and so they break down in contact with our atmosphere, and where it's much different than down here. And they break down, they weather. Okay, and we're going to build up our weathering front, our pile of weathered material on the mountain flank. Gravity will then impact it, where we're going to start transporting that stuff off our hill slopes or mountains via hill slope processes, which we covered last time. And those hill slope processes are going to dump that sediment into our rivers and streams down here for fluvial transport. Rivers then take it the rest of the distance back out off our continents, back into the ocean basins, where the water can evaporate and the sediment can get compacted and cooked and eventually melt, completing the rock cycle and the hydrologic cycle. Okay, that's what we're talking about right here, rivers and streams. Okay, the end point for rivers, their deltas, is where that sediment gets dumped. I'm kind of jumping to the end game here, but this is key. Never forget that rivers are always working. You might look at rivers and streams and it's just pretty water. You're swimming in. It doesn't really look like they're moving much of anything. But rivers are always moving sediment off our continents. This is what it looks like when the Amazon in South America hits the ocean, and you can just see how much sediment's getting dumped out into the ocean. Okay, this is happening all over the world in all the rivers. Okay, so here's our key concept. Please write this down, probably 3 times. Rivers only want the energy, right, the power, the movement to transport the water that's in the rivers and the sediment that's being supplied to them from hill slope processes and other rivers and streams to our ocean basins, and nothing more. Rivers only want the energy to transport their water and supplied sediment to the ocean basins and nothing more. So what the heck does that mean? What it means is that rivers have a gradient or a profile that they construct that allows them to maintain this. okay? This concept. And that is what we call our equilibrium gradient. So this slope right here, here's the river up here at the top heading down, and then it goes out here and dumps into the ocean basin. This slope is what we would call the river's equilibrium gradient or equilibrium slope. Okay? The river generally cuts that slope in the mountain front up here and then deposits sediment down here to build the slope down here. There's a reason it's steeper up here in the mountains and shallower down here. Okay? Up here in the mountains, you have a lot of rock getting dumped into rivers and streams from the mountains, right? You're right next to your hill slope source, and you also don't have very big rivers up here. So in order for those rivers to transport the supplied sediment, it needs to be steep. They need more energy. The steeper the slope, the more energy to move sediment and rocks. As you move on down, we're going to get shallower, okay, not quite as steep. We're moving away from the mountain front. We're starting to have tributaries pour in, giving us more water, giving us more energy. And if we have more energy for more water, we don't want as steep a slope. The rivers don't want as steep a slope, okay? And so they get a more gradual profile till eventually, as they get near the mouth where they enter the ocean, they're very, very flat. Rivers are flowing actually very, very flat here, and that's because they have a ton of energy, okay? They're huge rivers with a ton of energy, and they're moving rock, but the rock they're moving is tiny. Okay, we're moving sand, silt, and clay down here, versus up here we have cobbles and boulders and other things. So rivers don't need that much energy down here, and they need a ton of energy up here. The rivers build this slope, this profile to do what they do. If it ever gets messed up, if it ever gets steeper down here, let's say it heads off down here, the river is not going to want that steep slope. It's going to have too much energy, and it's going to erode back and flatten off that gradient. Okay? If it ever gets too shallow, let's say up here it gets really flat, the river doesn't have enough energy. Well, at that point, all the sediment that it's moving will pile up till eventually the river can rebuild its profile. And the net result is, sorry to be repetitive, rivers only want the energy to transport their water and supplied sediment to the ocean basins and nothing more. So here are some key concepts. Take a minute, maybe pause the slideshow and write these down. First one is discharge, the amount of water flowing in a river. Simple enough. Slope, we talked about in the last slide, the inclination of the river channel, right? Steepness. Sediment load is the amount of sediment being transported in a river. And then vegetation is what you have, any kind of plants you have growing along the channel, like trees, and within the channel, root systems and things like that. Okay, so this slide is busy, and I apologize about that. And this is a weird analogy, and it's my analogy. I don't really know how helpful this is going to be, but I tried to think of an analogy for this river thing that might help it make more sense. Okay, so the idea is, if you think of a river like an airline company, which is a bit odd, they have something in common, right? They both want to be in equilibrium. And so an equilibrium for an airline company is you want just enough fuel to move your planes from point A to point B. That way you're not hauling extra weight around the sky. And you want your seats full of passengers to get to your destinations. If a company can do that, that airline is making as much money as it can make. Okay? Just like a river. A river wants just enough fuel, right, which basically comes from slope, to move the water and sediment in the river channel and get it to the ocean basin, just so that right when it gets to the ocean basin, there's no energy left. That's the ultimate condition. This plane, in a perfect world, as soon as it touchdowns on land, poof, the engine shut off because it runs out of fuel. That's absolutely perfect. Obviously, airline companies aren't going to do that because margin of error is too tight. But that's the idea. The rivers want just enough energy to get that sediment to the end, poof, and then it's done. Now over here, let's say your airline is too full. You have too many passengers, okay, and not enough fuel to get to your location. Now in fuel in this situation, I'm not saying the plane is going to fall out of the sky, although it's one way to look at it. But think about a plane where people are sitting on the aisles and stuff like that. It's maxed out. It's too full. It doesn't have enough energy to efficiently transport the passengers on its plane. And I guess in this analogy, the plane would fall out of the sky. which is terrible, but that's the idea. Okay, it's too full. The airline isn't going to be making money here because no one wants to fly an airline. The planes are falling out of the sky, but it's also too crowded and too packed. Okay, over here it's too empty. If you're flying planes 2 and 4, that company is spending a lot of money on energy to move hardly anybody from to their destination. So they're not going to make any money. They're expending too much energy to move hardly any passengers. So they're always going to try and adjust between these two to get this perfect equilibrium, just like rivers. Man, I hope that made some sense. Okay, now response. Let's say the river falls out of equilibrium, and rivers are out of equilibrium all the time. I mean, if you have a flood, the river's out of equilibrium. Okay? If a river gets out of equilibrium, what's it do? How does it respond? Well, let's say something happens to the river. It needs to add energy. Okay? Let's say a bunch of sediment gets dumped into it, whatever. The river needs to add energy. So what it can do is it can steepen its slope, it can narrow its channel, it can shorten its path from point A to point B so it doesn't meander as much, and it can make a fine bed channel where it's very, very smooth on the bottom and there isn't a whole lot of friction. These are the 4 ways that if rivers alter their channel, they'll add energy to their system. Now keep in mind, I'm not saying rivers think about this. They're like, dang, man, I'd love to have a narrow channel. That'd be awesome. It's not like that at all. It's just that when they start running out of energy and they need more, however the sediment dumps out of the river or stream, it might build a narrow channel, giving it more energy. It might build a steeper slope, giving it more energy because it's steeper. You might get point bar erosion, which narrows your shortens your channel, and you might deposit fine-grained material, making a smooth bed. Okay, so this is a little bit like, it could happen a variety of ways. The most common, though, is aggradation. The river dumps its sediment because it doesn't have enough energy, and it makes it steeper. The opposite is also the case. Let's say a river needs to lose energy. It has too much. It's like, it's roaring. It's going crazy. It can either shallow its slope, widen its channel, lengthen its channel by meandering more, or generate a coarse bed on the bottom of the channel, so you get a bunch of sharp angular rocks that eat up friction on the bottom of the bed. Rivers can shallow their slope through nick points, which are basically waterfalls that retreat back over time and erode out the channel, making the gradient not as steep. It can widen the channel by eroding at cut banks on the side of the river, which eats up more energy. Also, through cutbank erosion, you can end up with more meanders, which the river then has to flow a longer distance to get from point A to point B, which requires more energy. And it can erode fines on the bed and coarsen up the channel bottom. So here's an example of channel aggradation. This is a river, I believe it's in China, and you can tell it's very, very muddy. Okay, there's tons of sediment being dumped into this, and that's because there's a mine nearby. Well, if a river gets a bunch of sediment dumped into it, before it was in equilibrium, but now it has all this more work to do, right? It's like you called it over to help you move, and you just keep dumping boxes and boxes on it. It needs more energy to move all the stuff being dumped into it, so it dumps the sediment. This is a braided channel. It's dumping that sediment back and forth across the channel so it can get steep enough to move all that sediment out. Channel incision is the opposite. This is what happens when rivers need to lose energy. Over here is Niagara Falls. This is after they shut it off. I'm not sure how they do that. But it's a big waterfall that retreats back over time. And down here off this slope, the channel is shallower than it is up here. The channel's steeper up here. And so this waterfall works its way back to make the slope less, to eat up the excess energy. And the reason Niagara Falls is cutting in, or has these waterfalls moving back, is because a big glacier was here in the past. The glacier's gone. Now the land is rebounding back up, and it's steepening the slope, and the river is trying to get rid of that extra energy from that steeper slope by cutting these nick points back. I apologize. It would be difficult for us to go outside in a video. We'll be going outside in lab. Here's an example of channel incision. This is up in the Canyonlands National Park in Utah. This is like the world's prime example of channel incision, where basically every river system in this area has too much energy, and they're all cutting back. Okay, there's a nick point. Here's a waterfall here, only when it rains, but waterfall here, and these guys are all eating back. Even the Green River out here doesn't have waterfalls, but it's definitely cutting down over time. Okay, channel widening and narrowing. I covered it kind of in the previous slide, but the idea is if the river is flowing over a wide area, the water is shallow, it has contact with a large portion of the bed, it eats up energy and it slows it down. If it can get kind of narrow, more of a box, more water flows in the center of the channel without touching the bank, and it flows more efficiency without touching the sides. So the higher width to depth ratios, the more energy loss to friction. The lower width depth ratios, the more energy efficient it is. Here's an example of channel widening. This river had excess energy, and what it's doing here is it's generating these cut banks that are eating into its former floodplain, this terrace, and allows itself to widen out. Okay. Here's an example of narrowing. This is actually a poor example because it's actually cutting down. If you're going to narrow a channel, it'll actually build it out of sediment. I just couldn't find a picture that does that. So channel meanders, like I said, I already covered this, but rivers tend to meander over time as they swirl in their currents. As they go downstream, they'll generate these meanders. More meanders makes them longer, takes up more energy. Less meanders makes it flow straighter, saves energy. This is the famous cutoff meander. This is one way in which rivers kind of straighten their course. So here's a river, has this big old meander here, flows this long distance, and eventually this cut bank will meet this cut bank, and the two meet, and now all of a sudden you end up with this lake where the river used to flow, known as an oxbow lake. Now the river has dramatically shortened its travel. It's gained energy through this process. And here's the famous oxbow lake in the making. This is like every geomorphologist's dream. Wish I could have been there when it happened. Okay, so here's our key concepts again. Discharge is the amount of water flowing in a river. Slope, the inclination of the river channel. Sediment load, sediment transported, and vegetation along and within the channel. Remember, our key concept. Rivers only want the energy to transport their water and supplied sediment to ocean basins and nothing more. Because if it does have more, it's going to do something. It's going to respond. If it has less, it's going to do something. It's going to respond. Okay, just to reinforce what we've already covered. Hill slopes, I guess we covered more than this, but the big picture is hill slopes dump that sediment into rivers, and then rivers' job is to move that stuff down into the ocean basins. But they generate this longitudinal profile where it's steeper up here and shallower down here. And they build that to maintain that equilibrium where they have just enough energy to get that sediment to... Okay, gang, so here's our things to know for this lecture. Key concepts of fluvial systems. What do rivers do in the geomorphic system? Remember, they move hill slope sediment to the ocean basins and the deltas. What is a river's equilibrium gradient? Remember, that's that slope that rivers build where they can have just enough energy to move the sediment supplied to them and water and nothing more. And then how do rivers respond to channel change so they stay in equilibrium? So if they have, rivers end up with too much energy, they'll incise their channel, they'll widen, they'll coarsen their bed, or they'll meander more. Okay, the opposite if they need to gain energy. All right, guys, thanks so much. See you in lab.